Reviewing Hours of Darkness is somewhat difficult. I feel like everyone had a different expectation as to what these Far Cry expansions were going to be, though I think most people were expecting some big bombastic standalone expansion like Blood Dragon, myself included. Unfortunately, this isn't quite what we got, but the expansions are only $12, so I can't really fault it entirely. Like I said, it makes it kind of difficult to review this expansion. Hours of Darkness is not attached to anything else Far Cry related. Like most things Far Cry, they're completely separate from every other game, with the exception of a few references and a few reoccurring characters. This one is based in the Vietnamese War, and it's not standalone. You will have to own Far Cry 5 to get this expansion. This does have some benefits. The new guns are added to the base game and you can use them whenever you want, which is pretty cool, but I'll talk more about this a little bit later. The expansion itself honestly doesn't do a whole lot. It is based in the Vietnamese War, but I feel like this is a really big missed opportunity. The story is forgettable because it basically doesn't exist. I can sum up the entire story in a few sentences, and this is not a spoiler because you get all this information at the beginning of the game. The opening cinematic portrays you and your squad being in a helicopter that eventually gets shot down because, fuck it, all helicopters get shot down in video games. When you crash land, you have to make your way to the extraction point on the other side of the map, and that's it. That's the whole story. There's nothing more to it. The Vietnam War was really messed up. And I feel like they could have done a lot with this setting, but they just kind of didn't. I don't even remember the main character's name. It's not important. Hell, they even mention Agent Orange in this expansion. You come across this field with a bunch of orange gas, and your main character says, wow, this stuff is really nasty, and then it's never mentioned again. Now, all of this could be forgiven if the gameplay was really good. After all, it's a video game, and it's a shooter, so gameplay comes above all else. If you have really good gameplay and a bad story, I will forgive the bad story because the gameplay is really fun and addictive. But unfortunately, the gameplay is pretty much just as bland as the story. Now, to clarify, it's not bad, it just doesn't really add anything. The game does change things up a little bit with the perk system. There's no skill tree anymore, you can kind of just do most things like takedowns and stuff like that, but they did change how stealth works with the perk system. Every time you get a kill undetected, you get a new perk. This can stack up to 4 times, until you are spotted and then you lose all these perks. I'm kind of indifferent, but am not really a big fan of this system. This sort of locks you into a stealth-only approach, and then once you get spotted, you're punished pretty hard for it. The Vietnamese come out from every direction, and it's not like you can't win. It's not actually that hard in that way, but it makes your life a lot more difficult, so you don't really have much reason to do anything but stealth. And if you really like going guns blazing, it feels like the game is punishing you for not being stealthy. If you're curious as to what these stealth perks are, the first one is the Adrenaline perk, which allows you to move faster while crouched and will also auto-tag enemies within 10 meters. The second one is the Ghost perk, which reduces the noise you make while walking, sprinting, and landing, and fall damage is also reduced. The third perk is the Sixth Sense perk, which will automatically tag enemies that are about to detect you, as well as making predators less inclined to attack you, so wild animals won't attack you as much. The fourth perk is Predator, which allows you to tag enemies through walls using the binoculars, and also auto-tag enemies up to 20 meters. So these are very useful to have, and losing them does feel like a pretty big detriment. But aside from this, the gameplay is relatively the same. You do have guns for hire, which come in the form of your squad mates that got shot down in the helicopter and are scattered throughout the map. You can rescue them, and then they become one of your guns for hire that are actually pretty useful. But if they get downed and you cannot revive them, well, they're dead forever and they don't come back. Unfortunately, you also don't get some sort of pet to help you along, which is disappointing because there's a good amount of panthers in this game. I personally would have loved to have a panther as one of the pets that helps you along. Even if it would have worked the same as, say, the cougar in the base game, that's still better than it just not existing. Which kind of seems like the main tone of this expansion. A lot of stuff just kind of doesn't exist. Vast majority of the game, you're just going to be shooting Vietnamese soldiers, and that's really your main enemy. The only other enemies, quote-unquote enemies, you can come across is a wild boar that will occasionally attack you, or a lot of the panthers around that most of the time will just run away from everything and not even attack you. The Vietnamese soldiers will occasionally fly helicopters after you and get into a truck, but they don't do a whole lot else. They do have 2 heavier units, one being a flamethrower unit and another being an LMG unit, both of which we saw in the base game, so it would have been cool if they added something different, like, say, a unit that used gas, something like that. Something to be a little bit different from the base game, but it just kind of doesn't. Now, I did say earlier in this review that the whole point of the plot is that your helicopter went down and you need to get to the extraction point. But there is a good amount of stuff in between there, albeit all optional. You do want to do it though. When your helicopter goes down, that's when you can see the entire map, and if you really want to, you can just ignore everything and go straight to the extraction point and beat the expansion in probably an hour and a half, but I don't know why you would do this. There's a decent amount of Vietnam jungle that you can explore that has different alternative objectives. For example, rescuing other squad members that were trapped as prisoners of war, and taking out AA guns, allowing you to use airstrikes which are actually very satisfying to use. You look through your binoculars and click where you want an airstrike to land, and this is a big explosion, but you're limited as to how many you can use. The max you can have is 5, but when you do these alternative objectives, you'll get another airstrike or so that you can use. It's really easy to do and feels pretty intuitive. It was actually pretty fun. I do have to give credit where credit is due, this game looks really good. And this is to be expected. Far Cry games have always looked very good. They've always been a PC first to make the graphics as good as possible type of game. You can see this in the base game of Far Cry 5, and you shouldn't really be expecting the expansion to look any worse than the base game. It does the Vietnamese jungle justice. Although something I found really entertaining is that the Vietnamese jungle actually felt less chaotic than Montana. For the most part, you didn't constantly have people attacking you at every moment. There was some peace for you to just look through the jungle, which is a nice change of pace, because that was one of my biggest complaints about the core game of Far Cry 5. Unfortunately, all the positives end there because I have some really big complaints that kind of killed the expansion for me. Let's talk about the guns. Guns are very important in a shooter. They're how you interact with the world around you, and they dictate your playstyle. The gun you're carrying is going to dictate how you approach a certain situation. If you have a shotgun, you're not going to treat that situation the same way as if you had a sniper. Even then, if you have a semi-automatic sniper, you're going to act very differently than a bolt action. Having good weapon variety is very important when it comes to shooters. Just as important to this weapon variety is constantly giving the player new weapons to refresh their mind saying, how do I use this gun? Do I really like this gun? And, just having new toys to play with. Because let's face it, guns are cool. Some of my most popular videos are my weapon showcase videos. People just want to see how guns translate in video game form, and they want to see the different animations, and, well, guns just make for fun video game mechanics. There is very rarely a situation where having more guns would be a bad thing. This expansion flops really hard in this regard. Almost all the weapons in this expansion are just recycled weapons from the base game. The 1911, the AK, the revolver, most of these are just guns that we had already used before and aren't new. Now, if it was just a few of them, I would forgive the game because, yeah, there's going to be an AK in Vietnam, yeah, there's going to be a 1911 in Vietnam, what do you expect? But unfortunately, it's almost every single gun, and there's really not a whole lot new. Even the guns that are quote-unquote new aren't really new. Take the M16 for example. This is just the AR we had in the base game reskinned. Same reload animation and everything. Same thing with the M60. It's just the base M60 E4 we saw in the main game, but now the Vietnam era model. Again, same reload and everything. The only true new gun that we got in this expansion is the Dragunov. And again, it's left-handed. Ubisoft, why? Why do you continue to make this gun left-handed? It drives me insane. Okay, the left-handed thing is nitpicking. It still doesn't make sense to me. Even then, we kind of have seen this gun in previous Far Cry games. I'll give them a little bit of slack because it looks better now, it has different textures, and the reload is different. It's not just recycled from the previous games. But still, this is the only new gun we had in this expansion, and we've used it before. This is a huge missed opportunity. There were so many weapons in Vietnam War that you could have added into this game. You could have added a PPSH, you could have added a MAT 49, you could have added a Scorpion. There's so many weapons to talk about, but they just don't exist. Hell, even the easy options didn't exist. The MAC-10 that was in the base game, you don't ever get that in this expansion. Or how about the M14? You could have just done something really easy with the M14 and made it select fire, thrown it in, and gone, hey look, this is kind of a new gun, because there wasn't a fully automatic M14 in the base game, and I would have been okay with it, but in fact, you don't even get an M14. There just doesn't exist in this. There are a few things that make this even worse. Whenever you take over a camp, which there isn't too many of them, but whenever you do take over a camp, there's no outpost or anything in the camp for you to change out your weapons or whatever you want to do, so the guns you have on you and the guns you find out on the field are the guns you're going to be using. You don't really have much choice here. So if you find something that's really good, like a suppressed Dragunov, you don't want to drop this, so you'll probably have it till the end of the game, limiting what you can do and what you want to do even more. And there's one thing that this expansion does that just drives me insane. When you first launch the expansion, you only have the choice of the normal difficulty mode. In the normal difficulty mode, you only have 3 weapon slots, 2 primaries and 1 pistol. Since you don't ever get an automatic pistol and your only choices are a 1911, a suppressed 1911, and a revolver, this is basically just 2 primaries. There's not really too much use of the secondary. You can get some use out of the suppressed 1911, but for real, if you have a suppressed M16 or a suppressed sniper, you're not really going to use it much. Well, how do you get the 4th weapon slot, you might say? You can't. You only have 3 weapons, one of which being a pistol, until you beat the game, and then you unlock 2 other difficulty modes, one being survival difficulty, which just gives you less health and makes the game more difficult, and the other being the war mode difficulty, which gives you the 4th weapon slot and unlimited airstrikes. Why the fuck can't I have 4 weapons by default? Why is it just not in normal difficulty? This doesn't help the player at all. This just further limits what I can do. And it taunts you, the whole expansion. You press Q to bring up that thing, the item inventory thing, and you see that 3rd weapon, 3rd primary slot, and it's grayed out, with the X on it, there's a lock there. You can't get it, but you see it, you know that you should be able to, and it's fucking bullshit. I seriously don't know why they did this, and the whole expansion just kind of feels like a missed opportunity. And again, I need to clarify, it's not bad, it's just bland. It's really obvious that this is just an outsourced expansion without a whole lot of life to it. Sure, the jungle environment looks good, but it's lacking atmosphere. Imagine if you played Far Cry 2, but Far Cry 2 didn't have the depressing atmosphere that you saw in Africa. Well, that would get pretty boring really quick, right? Because Far Cry 2 doesn't really have much story going for it, but the atmosphere is so rich that you kind of just want to keep playing. It kind of just keeps your attention. I didn't get that same feeling when I was playing through this expansion. I was feeling very burnt out very quick. It didn't really throw anything new at me to make me do anything different, so just a really big meh. In fact, if I had to give a rating system out of 10, I would give it a meh out of 10. It's one of these expansions that ends up being so bland, it's almost worse than just being bad. Now keep in mind, I say this as a really big Far Cry fan. I've liked every Far Cry game, if we ignore Primal, up until this expansion. And I didn't hate this expansion, I just didn't care for it. I think my biggest problem is that I just had too high expectations. When you say Far Cry expansion, you think Blood Dragon, and really don't think this. Don't think this coming into this expansion. You will end up disappointed. It's an outsourced $12 expansion. It's not a standalone game. You should be expecting what you get, but again, I was a little disappointed. That about sums up my review for Far Cry 5 Hours of Darkness. I hope the Mars expansion will be much better than this one. It's looking pretty entertaining. I have the Season Pass, so I'll be making a review of all the expansions. If you've enjoyed this review, consider checking out my Patreon. I really could use the help given how YouTube is kind of not really financially viable anymore, so anything you guys could give would be a huge help to me. And seriously, thanks to everyone that just gives bits and watches me on Twitch and subscribes to me, and you guys are over my Patreon. You guys help me so much, you have no idea. Hope you've enjoyed this review, and I will see you next time.